It was an ordinary evening in the heart of a bustling city, the kind of night where streetlights reflected off the wet pavement and the low hum of distant sirens blended with the chatter of people heading home. A scene that anyone could pass by without a second thought. But beneath the surface of this seemingly routine evening, something extraordinary was about to unfold, something that would expose hidden truths, shatter assumptions, and leave everyone involved questioning what they thought they knew about justice and fairness. Two men stood by a parked car on the edge of a quiet street. Their casual appearance might not have drawn much attention. One wore a dark hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, while the other was dressed in a simple blue jacket. They spoke quietly, their voices low, blending into the ambient noise around them. But what they didn't know was that they were being watched, and not in the way most people imagine. Just across the street, sitting in an unmarked patrol car, two officers were observing them closely, their eyes scanning every move, their radios buzzing faintly with updates. The officers, dressed in crisp uniforms and equipped with everything from flashlights to body cameras, were convinced they had stumbled upon something suspicious. From their vantage point, the two men by the car fit what they thought was a profile, and that's where the story takes its first turn. What the officers saw wasn't a crime being committed. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary at all. Yet, their biases, whether conscious or not, were shaping the narrative in their minds. To them, the scene felt off, and that feeling was enough to spur them into action. As the moments ticked by, the tension started to rise. The officers exited their vehicle, their polished boots crunching against the gravel as they made their way toward the two men. Their body language was assertive, almost confrontational, even though the men had done nothing wrong. The officers didn't stop to consider the possibility that their assumptions might be wrong, that their approach might be based on prejudice rather than evidence. They didn't pause to question the fairness of their actions. "Hands where we can see them," one officer barked as they approached. The sharp tone cut through the night, startling the two men, who quickly turned toward the source of the voice. Confusion flickered across their faces, followed by a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. They raised their hands, doing exactly what they were told, yet their compliance did little to ease the tension. "What's going on?" one of the men asked, his voice calm but firm, as if he had experienced this kind of situation before. There was no anger in his tone, no sign of resistance, just a genuine attempt to understand why they were being confronted. The officers, however, weren't interested in explanations. They began firing off questions. "Where are you from? What are you doing here? Do you have any weapons on you?" The men answered each one patiently, though their answers seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officers appeared more focused on reinforcing their assumptions than on truly listening. It was as if they were determined to find something incriminating, no matter how insignificant. As the interaction escalated, the tension in the air became almost tangible. Passers-by slowed their steps, some pausing to watch from a safe distance, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. The scene was uncomfortable to witness, yet no one intervened. Some took out their phones, recording the encounter quietly, while others whispered among themselves, unsure of how to react. The officers began to frisk the two men, their movements quick and methodical, their faces showing no signs of empathy or doubt. It was clear they believed they were in the right, that their actions were justified. But then something unexpected happened, something that neither the officers nor the onlookers could have anticipated. As one of the officers reached into the pocket of the man in the hoodie, his hand brushed against something metallic. He pulled it out, his expression shifting from one of authority to confusion. It was a badge that carried more weight and significance than anything he had expected to find. The officer froze for a moment, staring at the badge as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His partner noticed the change in his demeanor and stepped closer, glancing at the badge himself. "What's this?" the officer finally asked, his voice noticeably less confident than before. The man in the hoodie didn't respond right away. He glanced at his friend, who gave a subtle nod, and then turned back to the officers. "You tell me," he said calmly, his tone steady and unwavering. The officer's grip on the badge tightened as he examined it more closely. His eyes darted between the badge and the man holding it, realization slowly dawning on him. This wasn't just any badge. It was an official identification that revealed the true identity of the man he had been threatening. And he wasn't alone. The second man, standing quietly nearby, reached into his own pocket and pulled out an identical badge, holding it up for the officers to see. At that moment, the balance of power shifted completely. The officers, who had approached the situation with such confidence and authority, now found themselves on unsteady ground. The realization that the men they had been targeting were undercover agents left them stunned, their assumptions unraveling before their very eyes. But the story doesn't end here. This was just the beginning of a much larger revelation, one that would expose deep-seated issues and spark a conversation that couldn't be ignored. What happened next would challenge everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths, forcing them to question their actions, their beliefs, and the systems that allowed such encounters to take place. And that's where we leave things for now, a turning point in a story that's far from over. What began as an ordinary evening had quickly transformed into an extraordinary event, one that would leave a lasting impact on everyone who witnessed it. Stay tuned, because the twists and turns are just getting started. You won't want to miss what happens next. Underscore 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 underscore. This sets up your story with suspense and tension, leaving the audience eager to hear the rest of the narrative. If you'd like further sections or adjustments, let me know. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire world had stopped. The officers, who had moments ago exuded confidence and control, now looked as though the ground beneath them had vanished. Their eyes darted between the badges and the faces of the two men, searching for some explanation that might make this situation less unsettling. But no amount of searching would change the reality of what was unfolding. The man in the hoodie shifted slightly, lowering his badge but keeping his eyes locked on the officer who had frisked him. "You're probably wondering who we are," he said, his voice calm, but with a sharpness that hinted at his controlled frustration. The second man, still holding his badge, didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to demand attention. The officers exchanged a quick glance, the panic in their eyes poorly concealed by their forced composure. "I think we deserve an explanation for this," the man in the blue jacket finally said, breaking his silence. His tone was measured, but there was a weight behind his words that made them feel heavier than they might have otherwise. But before the officers could respond, one of the men, the one in the hoodie, continued. "You see, we're just minding our business. But you decided to escalate this." He gestured to the people watching from the sidelines, some of whom were still holding up their phones, recording the interaction. "You decided we looked suspicious. Why is that?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered. The officers didn't know how to respond. How could they? To answer honestly would mean confronting biases they likely didn't even want to acknowledge, let alone admit in front of an audience. But the silence only deepened the tension. As the crowd grew, so did the unease. A few murmurs rippled through the bystanders, voices wondering aloud what had led to this confrontation. Some spoke in hushed tones, trying to piece together the story. Others were bolder, openly questioning the officers' actions. "Why did they stop them in the first place?" someone asked. "They didn't even do anything." The man in the blue jacket turned his head slightly, just enough to address the growing audience. "We're here tonight for a reason," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "And I think everyone deserves to know what's really going on." But before he could say more, one of the officers, clearly desperate to regain some sense of control, spoke up. "Look, this is all just a misunderstanding," he said, though his voice lacked the authority it had earlier. Let's talk about this somewhere else." The man in the hoodie raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "You drew conclusions about us before you even spoke to us. You assumed we were up to no good, and now you want to sweep it under the rug." It wasn't a question so much as a statement of fact, and the officer didn't deny it. He couldn't. The man in the hoodie glanced at his partner, giving a subtle nod. "We're not going anywhere," he said firmly, turning his attention back to the officers. "Not until we address what happened here tonight." His partner finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "The thing about assumptions is, they can get people hurt, or worse." He let the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "And when those assumptions are rooted in prejudice, they don't just hurt individuals, they hurt entire communities." The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. It was clear that this moment had become about more than just the four people involved. It was a mirror held up to the broader issues that had plagued society for far too long. But just as the tension seemed ready to boil over, a voice crackled over the officers' radios. It was a call from dispatch, one that seemed urgent, though the words were muffled and hard to make out. The officers hesitated, torn between their duties and the situation unfolding in front of them. The man in the blue jacket took a step closer, his movements deliberate but non-threatening. "You might want to take that," he said, his voice tinged with something that could have been mistaken for sympathy. "But before you do, ask yourselves, how did we get here? And more importantly, how are you going to fix it?" The officer holding the radio finally responded, his voice low and hurried. Whatever the call was about, it was clear that it demanded their attention. But as the officers began to back away, their faces still etched with uncertainty, the two men didn't move. They remained where they were, standing tall and resolute, watching as the officers retreated toward their vehicle. The crowd began to disperse, though not entirely. Some lingered, their curiosity still piqued, while others moved on, carrying with them the story of what they had just witnessed. But the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. The two men exchanged a knowing look, their eyes reflecting a mix of frustration, determination, and something else that was harder to define. They had a mission, one that couldn't be derailed by a single encounter. And as they turned to leave, disappearing into the shadows of the city, one thing was certain: the truth behind their presence that night would soon come to light. The night had revealed cracks in the facade, exposing truths that couldn't be ignored. And while the officers may have walked away with their authority intact, the questions raised by their actions would linger far longer than the confrontation itself. What happened next would challenge everything, every assumption, every bias, and every belief about justice, accountability, and the role of those sworn to protect and serve. The stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined, and the ripple effects of that night would be felt far beyond the city's streets. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The events of that night were just the beginning, and what lies ahead will reveal truths that can't be silenced or ignored. The air was thick with unspoken words as the two men walked away from the scene, their strides purposeful yet measured. Their expressions remained calm, betraying little of the storm that brewed beneath the surface. The night wasn't over for them. In fact, it was just beginning. What had transpired was not just an unfortunate encounter. It was a symptom of a deeper issue, one they were determined to confront head-on. But there was more to this mission than anyone watching could have guessed. As they rounded a corner and disappeared from view, their movements became more deliberate. They slipped into a nondescript black sedan parked just out of sight and closed the doors in silence. The tension inside the car was palpable, though neither of them spoke right away. The man in the hoodie leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply as he stared out the window. His partner, now behind the wheel, adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning the street for any sign that they'd been followed. They didn't even ask the right questions, the man in the hoodie finally said, breaking the silence. His tone was a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "They didn't have to," his partner replied, his voice steady but edged with wariness. "They already had their answers before they even got out of the car." The man in the hoodie shook his head, his jaw tightening. And that's the problem. How many more people have to go through this before something changes? His partner didn't respond right away. Instead, he started the car, the quiet hum of the engine filling the silence. He navigated the empty streets with precision, their destination clear but unspoken. The two men weren't just undercover agents. They were part of a larger operation, a task force designed to root out corruption and bias within law enforcement. Tonight's encounter had been unplanned, but it wasn't entirely unexpected. They knew the risks of operating in plain sight, especially in neighborhoods where assumptions could be as dangerous as weapons. Their mission wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about understanding the systemic issues that allowed such encounters to occur. And while they had expected resistance, the blatant nature of the incident they had just experienced left them unsettled. It was one thing to hear about these encounters in reports or see them captured on video. It was another thing entirely to live through it. As they drove, the man in the hoodie, whose name was Marcus, pulled out his phone and began typing a message. His fingers moved quickly, the glow of the screen illuminating his face in the dimly lit car. His partner, Jordan, glanced over but didn't say anything. He knew Marcus well enough to understand that he needed to process things in his own way. When Marcus finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, more introspective. "We need to file this," he said, not looking up from his phone. Every detail. The way they approached us, the questions they asked, how they reacted when they saw the badges. All of it. Jordan nodded, his hands gripping the wheel a little tighter. "Already planned on it. But we need to be careful. If this gets out too soon..." Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp. "If this gets out too soon, it might actually make a difference." Jordan didn't respond immediately. He understood Marcus's frustration. He felt it too. But he also knew the importance of timing. Their work required precision, patience, and above all, discretion. A single misstep could jeopardize the entire operation, not to mention their safety. They pulled into the parking lot of a small building tucked away on a quiet street. The windows were dark, the sign above the door unlit, but the two men didn't hesitate. They exited the car and entered the building through a side door, their movements practiced and efficient. Inside, they were greeted by the faint hum of machinery and the soft glow of monitors lining the walls. A third man sat at one of the desks, his eyes glued to a screen displaying live feeds from various locations around the city. He turned as they entered, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "You're late," he said, his voice carrying a hint of reproach. "We had a situation," Marcus replied, setting his phone down on the desk. The man at the desk, Ben, raised an eyebrow, but didn't press for details. "Did you get what you needed?" Jordan nodded. "More than we expected." Ben leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against the armrest. "You know this is going to complicate things, right?" Marcus crossed his arms, his posture tense. "It's already complicated. We're just here to document it." Ben sighed, turning back to his monitors. "You're not wrong. But if this goes public before we're ready..." Jordan cut him off. "We're not making it public. Not yet, but it needs to be part of the report." Ben nodded reluctantly, his eyes scanning the screens in front of him. "Fine, but we need to be strategic about this. The last thing we want is for this to blow up in a way we can't control." The three men fell into a tense silence, the weight of their work pressing down on them. They knew the risks they were taking, the lines they were walking, but they also knew why they were doing it. For Marcus, the mission was personal. He had spent his entire life navigating a world where assumptions about his skin color often preceded any understanding of who he was as a person. For Jordan, it was about accountability, about holding a system he believed in to the standards it claimed to uphold. And for Ben, it was about the data, the facts, the undeniable truth that could be used to force change. As the night stretched on, they worked together to compile their report, documenting every detail of the encounter. They reviewed the footage from their hidden cameras, analyzing the officers' behavior, their tone, their words. They cross-referenced the incident with similar cases, building a comprehensive picture of the patterns they were uncovering. But even as they worked, the tension lingered. They knew that what they were doing was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle, and they knew that the road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and resistance. The events of the night had shaken them, but they had also strengthened their resolve. They were determined to see this mission through, no matter the cost, because at the end of the day, it wasn't just about them. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. And as they prepared to face whatever came next, one thing was clear: the truth was on their side, and they weren't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The days that followed the encounter were marked by a whirlwind of activity. Marcus, Jordan, and Ben worked tirelessly, piecing together a meticulous account of what had transpired. Every detail, every interaction, every word exchanged that night was scrutinized, replayed, and documented. Yet, as they delved deeper into the implications of the incident, a troubling pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just about one encounter or even one group of officers. It was systemic, pervasive, and disturbingly ingrained. The footage they captured showed more than just bias. It revealed a calculated abuse of power. The officers' body language, their tone, their dismissive attitude toward protocol, all of it painted a picture of a culture that had gone unchecked for far too long. But as compelling as the evidence was, the team knew it wasn't enough. They needed more than just one piece of the puzzle. They needed a complete picture, one that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. Marcus couldn't shake the memory of the officer's expressions when he revealed his badge. The shock, the disbelief, the brief flicker of fear, it all lingered in his mind like an echo. He had seen that look before, in different contexts, with different people. It was the look of someone who realized they'd made a grave miscalculation, but hadn't yet decided how to recover. And in this case, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Jordan, meanwhile, was focused on the bigger picture. He spent hours poring over case files, reviewing complaints, and cross-referencing incidents that mirrored their own experience. Patterns began to emerge: specific officers, precincts, and even neighborhoods where the complaints were disproportionately high. It was damning evidence, but it also made the mission more dangerous. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that they were treading on dangerous ground. Ben was the anchor of the team, keeping them grounded and focused. His expertise in data analysis and surveillance was unmatched, and he used it to weave together a narrative that would be impossible to refute. But even he couldn't deny the growing tension within the group. The weight of what they were uncovering was beginning to take its toll, and the pressure to act was mounting. One evening, as the three of them sat in their dimly lit office, Marcus broke the silence. "What if this doesn't change anything?" he asked, his voice heavy with frustration. "What if we go through all of this, put ourselves at risk, and nothing happens?" Jordan looked up from his laptop, his expression resolute. "It will change something," he said firmly. "It has to. People need to see this for what it is. They need to understand what's really happening out there." Ben leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "It's not just about the people who see it. It's about the people who have the power to do something about it. And that's where things get tricky." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Marcus's phone buzzing on the desk. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read the message. "We've got a problem," he said, his tone shifting. "One of the officers from that night. He's been asking questions. He knows something's off." Jordan stood up, his posture tense. "How much does he know?" "Enough to be dangerous," Marcus replied. "He's been digging into us, asking around. If he figures out who we are—" Ben cut in, his voice sharp. "We need to move faster. If they're onto us, we don't have much time." The room was suddenly alive with urgency. Plans were revised, precautions were doubled, and every move was calculated with precision. The stakes had officially been raised, and the margin for error had disappeared entirely. The next phase of their mission required them to go deeper undercover, pushing the limits of their roles and risking exposure at every turn. Marcus and Jordan returned to the neighborhoods where the tensions were highest, blending in and gathering intel. Every interaction was a test, every glance a potential threat. They knew they were being watched, but they also knew they couldn't afford to back down. One night, while conducting surveillance near the precinct tied to the officers in question, Marcus and Jordan noticed a group of officers gathered in the parking lot. Their conversation was animated, their body language tense. Marcus strained to hear, using a discreet microphone to capture snippets of their discussion. What he heard sent a chill down his spine. "They know something's up," one officer said, his voice low but clear. "We need to figure out who's behind this before it gets out of hand." Another officer nodded, his expression grim. "If they're digging into us, we've got to shut it down. Fast." Jordan glanced at Marcus, his jaw tightening. This was the confirmation they'd been waiting for and dreading. The officers weren't just suspicious, they were actively working to protect themselves, which meant the teens' window of opportunity was closing fast. As the two men drove away from the scene, the weight of their mission pressed down on them like never before. They had the evidence, the data, and the stories to back it up. But the forces working against them were formidable, and the consequences of failure were unthinkable. Back at their base, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Ben was already working on contingency plans, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he coordinated with their contacts and prepared for the inevitable backlash. Marcus and Jordan debriefed, their words clipped and focused. There was no room for doubt or hesitation now. As the night wore on, the team prepared for the next stage of their mission. They knew the risks, but they also knew the importance of what they were doing. Every step brought them closer to the truth, but it also brought them closer to danger. And as they braced themselves for what lay ahead, one thing was clear: the fight was far from over. The storm was coming, and they were right in the eye of it. The tension in the room was palpable as Marcus, Jordan, and Ben worked tirelessly, preparing for what they now understood would be a race against time. The weight of the evidence they had collected was undeniable, but so was the growing danger they faced. Each of them was aware that they were no longer operating in the shadows, their presence had been noticed, their actions scrutinized. And now, with the officers from the precinct actively trying to uncover their identities, the stakes had never been higher. Yet none of them could have anticipated what was about to happen next. It was a little past midnight when the knock came at the door. It wasn't loud or hurried, but it was firm enough to freeze everyone in their tracks. Marcus instinctively reached for the small handgun he kept tucked away, his heart pounding as he signaled for Jordan and Ben to stay quiet. Slowly, he approached the door, peering through the peephole. What he saw made his stomach drop. It wasn't a stranger standing on the other side. It was Detective Harris, one of their trusted allies on the inside. But the look on his face was anything but reassuring. Marcus opened the door, stepping aside to let him in. Harris quickly entered, glancing over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be following him. Once inside, he pulled off his jacket, his face tight with worry. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low. "A big one." Jordan and Ben joined them, their expressions mirroring the unease in the room. "What's going on?" Jordan asked, his tone sharp. Harris ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to find the right words. "They know," he finally said. "They figured out that you're not just regular guys. They don't know you're undercover agents yet, but they're suspicious enough to start digging. And they've already found out more than they should." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean, found out?" "They've got your descriptions," Harris replied. "Your faces, your movements, where you've been. And they've started connecting the dots. If they figure out who you really are, this whole operation is blown." Ben leaned forward, his mind racing. "How much time do we have?" "Not much," Harris admitted. "They're already pulling favors, using back channels to get information. And it gets worse. One of their guys, Sergeant Donovan, he's not just trying to protect himself. He's trying to use this as an opportunity. He thinks exposing you will make him untouchable, maybe even get him a promotion." The air in the room grew heavier with every word. Donovan wasn't just a threat, he was a wild card, ambitious, ruthless, and with enough influence to turn the tide against them. He was exactly the kind of person they couldn't afford to have as an enemy, and now he was actively hunting them. Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing. "We need to move," he said firmly. "If Donovan's making this personal, he's going to escalate things. We can't wait for him to come to us." Jordan nodded, his jaw tight. "Agreed, but we can't just react, we need to get ahead of him. If we can expose what he's doing, we can turn the tables." Harris hesitated, then pulled out a flash drive from his pocket. "This might help," he said, holding it up. "It's a copy of Donovan's internal records. Complaints that were buried, questionable transfers, payouts. It's not enough to take him down, but it's enough to raise some serious questions." Ben took the drive, his eyes narrowing as he examined it. "This is good," he said, "but we need more. If we're going to take Donovan out of the equation, we need something definitive, something he can't wiggle out of." "That's the problem," Harris said. "Donovan's careful. He doesn't leave a paper trail unless he's sure it's clean. If you're going after him, you'll have to catch him in the act." The room fell silent as the weight of the situation sank in. Catching Donovan in the act would mean putting themselves in even greater danger, taking risks that could compromise everything they'd worked for, but it was their best shot at stopping him and protecting their mission. As the team began to strategize, an idea began to take shape. They would use Donovan's own ambition against him, luring him into a situation where he would reveal his true colors. It was a risky plan, but it was their best chance to not only neutralize Donovan, but also gather the final piece of evidence they needed to expose the corruption. But just as they started to feel a sliver of hope, another twist emerged. Harris's phone buzzed, and when he glanced at the screen, his face went pale. "We've got a new problem," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're not just looking for you anymore. They're looking for me too." The revelation hit like a gut punch. Harris had been their lifeline on the inside, their source of critical information and support. If he was compromised, their entire operation was at risk. And if the corrupt officers found him, they wouldn't hesitate to silence him permanently. "We're running out of time," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "We need to act now. No more waiting, no more second-guessing. We take the fight to them." With that, the team began to mobilize, their determination hardening into resolve. The stakes had never been higher, and the danger had never been greater. But they were in too deep to turn back now. The battle lines were drawn, and as they prepared for the fight of their lives, one thing was certain: the storm was about to break. The night was heavy with tension as Marcus, Jordan, Ben, and Harris moved through the shadows, their plans set into motion. Every detail had been accounted for, every possible variable considered. Yet, as they neared the location where Donovan would be meeting his accomplices, there was an unshakable sense that things could still go horribly wrong. The air was cold, and the dim streetlights barely illuminated the abandoned warehouse district where they had chosen to lay their trap. It was the perfect setting for a final confrontation, a place where secrets could be unearthed and justice, if it came, would feel deserved. They had set up hidden cameras and recording equipment throughout the warehouse. The goal was simple: catch Donovan red-handed as he attempted to negotiate a deal that would secure his influence and bury the undercover team for good. Harris had used his connections to feed Donovan just enough information to bait him, and now they waited, nerves on edge, for the man himself to arrive. When Donovan finally showed up, he wasn't alone. 3 other officers were with him, all equally corrupt and eager to prove their loyalty. Marcus and the team watched from their concealed positions as Donovan began laying out his plans. His arrogance was palpable, his voice filled with smug confidence as he detailed how he intended to frame the undercover agents, manipulate the narrative, and come out as a hero in the department. It was a chilling moment, hearing the extent of Donovan's schemes. He spoke with ease about planting evidence, falsifying reports, and silencing those who posed a threat to his agenda. It wasn't just about protecting himself, It was about consolidating power, ensuring that no one could challenge him or the corrupt network he had built. Every word was being recorded, every damning admission captured on tape. The team knew they were close to victory, but they also knew they couldn't celebrate yet. The most dangerous part of the plan was still ahead. As the meeting progressed, Harris stepped out of the shadows, his presence sending a ripple of surprise through the room. Donovan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like he might panic. But then his expression shifted, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Harris," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "I should have known you'd try to play the hero, but you're out of your league." Harris didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his voice steady as he confronted Donovan. "You've gone too far, Donovan. This ends tonight." Donovan laughed, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse. "You think you're in control here. You're nothing but a pawn, Harris. And now you've walked right into my trap." Before anyone could react, Donovan gave a signal, and two of his men moved to block the exits. It was clear he had anticipated some kind of confrontation, and he had come prepared. For a moment, it seemed like the team's plan was about to unravel. But then Marcus and Jordan stepped forward, their badges displayed clearly for everyone to see. "We're federal agents," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "And you're under arrest." The shock on Donovan's face was almost satisfying. Almost, but the moment didn't last. Donovan's expression hardened, and he reached for his weapon, his desperation driving him to make one final reckless move. What happened next was a blur. Marcus and Jordan acted in unison, disarming Donovan before he could fire, while Harris and Ben subdued the other officers. It was chaotic and intense, but within moments, the situation was under control. As the team secured Donovan and his accomplices, the weight of the moment began to sink in. They had done it. They had gathered the evidence, exposed the corruption, and brought the perpetrators to justice. But just as they were starting to feel a sense of relief, a sound from outside the warehouse shattered the quiet, a slow, deliberate clapping. Everyone turned to see a figure stepping out of the shadows, their face obscured by the darkness. It was a man none of them recognized, but his presence was unsettling. He spoke with a calm, measured tone that sent chills down their spines. "Impressive," he said. "I didn't think you'd actually pull it off." Marcus stepped forward, his instincts telling him this wasn't over. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man smiled, his expression cold and calculating. "Let's just say I'm someone who's been watching very closely. And while you've done a fine job tonight, this is far from the end. You've made enemies you can't even begin to comprehend." With that, the man turned and disappeared into the night, leaving the team with more questions than answers. They had won the battle, but it was clear the war was far from over. The realization hit them like a tidal wave. There were deeper layers to this corruption, more players in the game than they had ever imagined. And as they stood in the dim light of the warehouse, the weight of what lay ahead began to settle over them. The mission had been a success, but it was only the beginning. The truth they had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg, and the fight for justice was far from finished. As they prepared to leave, each of them knew that their journey was far from over. The stakes were higher than ever, and the road ahead would be long and dangerous. But they were ready. Together, they would face whatever came next, no matter the cost. As the warehouse cleared out and law enforcement arrived to secure the scene, Marcus, Jordan, Harris, and Ben stood together, taking a moment to process everything that had just unfolded. The night had been chaotic, and while the tension was still thick in the air, there was also a quiet sense of accomplishment. They had dismantled Donovan's operation, exposed the corruption within the department, and prevented an injustice that could have spiraled into something far worse. Yet, the mysterious figure who had appeared at the end lingered in their minds, a haunting reminder that their fight wasn't entirely over. The arrest was swift and efficient. Donovan and his accomplices were taken into custody, their smug confidence replaced by a sullen, defeated silence. The evidence collected was irrefutable: recordings, documentation, and first-hand accounts that painted a clear picture of their crimes. The warehouse itself became a hub of activity as investigators combed through every inch, finding further proof of the web Donovan had spun to protect himself and those loyal to him. It was clear that their operation had been larger than anyone had initially realized, and while the night had dealt a significant blow to their efforts, it wasn't the final chapter. As dawn began to break, the team regrouped at a nearby safe house. The adrenaline of the night had started to fade, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. But there was also a sense of pride, a recognition of what they had accomplished together. Harris, who had taken the greatest personal risk by going undercover, finally allowed himself to exhale. He looked at the group and managed a small smile. "I wasn't sure we'd make it out of there," he admitted. "But we did. We really did." Jordan nodded, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "This was just the first step. We've taken down Donovan, but we've also uncovered something much bigger. That man who showed up tonight, whoever he is, he's part of something we haven't even begun to understand." Marcus agreed, his mind racing with possibilities. "We've shaken the foundation, but we haven't brought the whole house down yet. There are more people involved in this, more layers to uncover. And if we stop now, everything we've done tonight will be for nothing." Ben, ever the pragmatist, leaned back in his chair and let out a weary sigh. One thing at a time. For now, Donovan's behind bars, and his network is starting to crumble. That's a win. We should take a moment to appreciate it before we dive headfirst into whatever comes next. They all nodded, silently acknowledging the truth in his words. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they had achieved something meaningful, and that was worth celebrating, even if only briefly. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from Donovan's arrest sent shockwaves through the department and the city. Headlines blared the news of the corruption scandal, and the public reaction was immediate and intense. There was outrage, of course, but also a renewed sense of hope that justice could prevail. The recordings and evidence gathered by the team became the backbone of a sweeping investigation, one that reached far beyond Donovan and his inner circle. Other officers, administrators, and even community leaders who had been complicit in the corruption were exposed, their actions brought to light in a way that could no longer be ignored. The undercover agents became a symbol of resilience and integrity, their work praised by those who recognized the danger they had faced to bring the truth to light. But for Marcus, Jordan, Harris, and Ben, the attention was both a blessing and a burden. They were grateful for the recognition, but they also knew that their work wasn't about fame or accolades. It was about ensuring that the system they had sworn to protect and serve was held accountable, that the people they had risked everything to defend could trust in the institutions meant to uphold justice. Harris, in particular, found himself reflecting on the journey he had taken. Going undercover had been the hardest thing he had ever done, pushing him to confront not only the external challenges of the mission, but also the internal doubts and fears that had plagued him along the way. But standing on the other side of it, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew he wasn't alone. He had a team he could rely on, people who had his back no matter what, and that made all the difference. As the case against Donovan and his network moved through the courts, the team continued their work, quietly and diligently. They knew that the battle against corruption was ongoing, that there would always be those who sought to exploit their power for personal gain. But they also knew that they had the tools, the determination, and the unity to stand against it. And for every victory, no matter how small, they felt a renewed sense of hope. Months later, as the dust began to settle and the city started to heal, Marcus, Jordan, Harris, and Ben found themselves back at the safe house, reminiscing about the night that had changed everything. They had come a long way since then, but the bond they had forged in those tense, uncertain hours remained as strong as ever. "You know," Ben said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, "I never thought I'd say this, but I think we make a pretty good team." Jordan chuckled, raising a glass in a mock toast. "Here's to surviving the impossible and living to tell the tale." Harris joined in, his expression thoughtful. "And here's to whatever comes next, because if we've learned anything, it's that the fight is never really over." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "But we'll be ready, whatever it takes." As they clinked their glasses together, the weight of their journey seemed to lift, if only for a moment. They had faced the darkness and come out stronger, their resolve unshaken. And while the road ahead was uncertain, they knew one thing for sure: together they could face anything. The story of their victory spread far and wide, inspiring others to stand up against injustice and demand accountability. It wasn't a perfect ending, no story ever is, but it was a step in the right direction, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change was possible. And for Marcus, Jordan, Harris, and Ben, that was enough to keep moving forward.